The Philadelphia boarding house smelled of boiled cabbage and broken dreams. Eleanor Morrison sat at the edge of her narrow bed, reading the newspaper advertisement for the third time that morning. Her fingers trembled as they traced the words that promised a new life out west. The bruise on her cheekbone had faded to a sickly yellow, but the memory of how she got it remained fresh as yesterday's wound. She was 23 years old and had exactly two choices left in this world. She could marry Mr. Gerald Patterson, the tobacco merchant who had already made it clear that wives were property to be managed with a firm hand, or she could answer this advertisement and become a mail-order bride to a rancher in the Dakota Territory. Both options terrified her, but at least the stranger out west didn't smell of cigars and entitlement. Eleanor's mother had died 3 months ago, taking with her the last barrier between Eleanor and her father's gambling debts. The creditors had been patient at first, but patience had limits, and those limits had expired 2 weeks ago when they'd come to collect. They'd taken the furniture, the silver, even her mother's wedding ring. All that remained was Eleanor herself, and her father had made arrangements to settle his accounts by handing her over to Patterson like a piece of merchandise. The advertisement seemed almost romantic in its simplicity. Wanted, a respectable woman of good character to join a prosperous rancher in the Dakota Territory. Must be hard-working, honest, and willing to embrace a new life on the frontier. Companionship and security guaranteed. She had written her response that very night, lying about her circumstances just enough to seem respectable. She claimed her parents had passed and she sought a fresh start. It wasn't entirely untrue. The reply had come faster than she expected. The rancher's name was Samuel Thornton, and his letter was brief but not unkind. He needed a wife to help manage his household and perhaps, in time, raise a family. He would send money for her passage on the railroad. She should bring only what she could carry and prepare for a different kind of life than she had known in the city. Eleanor packed her belongings into a single worn carpet bag. She owned 3 dresses, a shawl her mother had knitted, a book of poetry, and a small daguerreotype of her parents on their wedding day. Everything else she had ever possessed was either sold or seized. She left the boarding house before dawn, not bothering to wake her father, who lay drunk and snoring in his room down the hall. She felt nothing as she walked away, not even grief. That well had run dry. The train station bustled with activity even at that early hour. Eleanor purchased her ticket with the money Samuel Thornton had sent, keeping enough aside for meals during the journey. She found a seat by the window and watched Philadelphia disappear into the distance as the locomotive gathered steam and headed west. With each mile, she felt the weight of her old life lifting, replaced by something she couldn't quite name. It felt dangerous to call it hope. The journey took 5 days. Eleanor watched the landscape transform from crowded cities to open farmland to endless prairie. She had never seen so much sky, so much space. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. The other passengers kept to themselves mostly, though an older woman traveling to visit her daughter offered Eleanor bread and cheese when the dining car prices proved too steep. On the 5th day, the train pulled into a small settlement called Redemption Creek. The platform was little more than wooden planks beside the tracks, and the town itself seemed to consist of perhaps 20 buildings scattered along a dusty main street. Eleanor stepped down from the train car, her legs unsteady after days of travel, and looked around for the man who was supposed to meet her. That was when she saw him. Samuel Thornton stood near the station house, holding his hat in his hands. He was older than she expected, perhaps 50, with gray threading through his brown hair. His face was weathered and hard, his eyes cold as winter stones. He looked her up and down with an expression that made her skin crawl. "Miss Morrison," he said flatly. "You'll do. Get in the wagon." Eleanor's heart sank into her stomach. She had escaped one prison only to walk straight into another. The wagon ride to Samuel Thornton's ranch stretched for 2 hours through rolling prairie that seemed to swallow the horizon whole. Eleanor sat rigid on the hard wooden seat, her carpet bag clutched in her lap like a shield. Thornton said nothing during the entire journey, his jaw set in a permanent scowl as he guided the horses along a rutted path that barely qualified as a road. The ranch, when it finally appeared, was nothing like Eleanor had imagined. The house was small and poorly maintained, with sagging steps and windows filmed with dirt. The barn leaned to one side as if contemplating surrender to the prairie wind. A few chickens scratched in the yard, and 2 skinny cows watched their approach with disinterest. This was not the prosperous spread Thornton had described in his letters. This was a failing homestead held together by desperation and lies. Thornton pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down without offering Eleanor any assistance. She managed to descend on her own, her city boots slipping on the worn step. He grabbed her carpet bag and headed toward the house, leaving her to follow. Inside, the reality grew even grimmer. The main room served as kitchen, dining area, and sitting room all at once. A pot-bellied stove squatted in one corner, its surface crusted with grease. Dirty dishes were piled in a wash basin. The floor hadn't seen a broom in weeks. "You'll sleep there," Thornton said, pointing to a narrow cot near the stove. "We'll get the marriage done tomorrow. Pastor comes through once a month, and tomorrow's the day. Lucky timing." Eleanor's throat went dry. "Perhaps we should take some time to become acquainted first." Thornton's laugh was harsh and humorless. "You think this is a courtship? You answered an advertisement. I paid for your passage. Tomorrow we marry, and then you'll earn your keep. I need someone to cook, clean, tend the animals, and warm my bed. That's what wives do out here." The way he said it made Eleanor feel like she'd been punched. She had known this arrangement was transactional, but the crude reality of it hit harder than she had prepared for. Still, what choice did she have? She had no money to return east. She knew no one in this territory. She was trapped just as surely as she had been in Philadelphia, only now she was thousands of miles from anything familiar. That night, Eleanor lay awake on the narrow cot, listening to Thornton's snoring from the bedroom. She stared at the ceiling beams and fought back tears that threatened to spill. She had prayed for deliverance from Gerald Patterson, but perhaps this was worse. At least Patterson had pretended at civility. Thornton didn't bother with pretense. The next morning, she woke to find Thornton already gone. A note on the table instructed her to prepare herself for the wedding. The pastor would arrive at noon. Eleanor washed as best she could with cold water from the pump outside and changed into her least worn dress, a simple gray cotton that had seen better days. She brushed her dark hair and pinned it up, studying her reflection in a cracked mirror. The woman looking back at her seemed like a stranger, someone who had aged years in a matter of days. At 11:30, she heard horses approaching. Eleanor went to the window and saw not a pastor but 3 riders coming fast. They wore leather and carried rifles, and even from a distance she could tell they were not friendly visitors. Thornton emerged from the barn, and the lead rider called out something Eleanor couldn't hear. The conversation grew heated quickly. Eleanor watched in horror as the confrontation escalated. The lead rider dismounted and shoved Thornton backward. Money was owed, the rider shouted loud enough for Eleanor to hear now. The cattle Thornton had promised as payment had never materialized. Patience had run out. Thornton tried to argue, but the rider struck him across the face with the back of his hand. What happened next occurred so quickly that Eleanor barely had time to process it. Thornton reached for something in his belt, but one of the mounted riders was faster. The crack of the rifle shot echoed across the prairie like thunder. Thornton crumpled to the ground and did not move. Eleanor stumbled backward from the window, her hand over her mouth to stifle a scream. The riders were dismounting now, heading toward the house. She looked around frantically for somewhere to hide, anywhere to escape. Her eyes landed on the back door. Without thinking, she grabbed her carpet bag and ran. She burst out the back of the house and sprinted toward the open prairie, her skirts tangling around her legs. Behind her, she heard shouting and the crash of the front door being kicked open. She ran harder than she had ever run in her life, her lungs burning, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had no plan, no destination, only the primal need to survive. Eleanor ran until her legs gave out beneath her. She collapsed in the tall grass, gasping for air, her entire body shaking with exhaustion and terror. Behind her, Thornton's ranch had disappeared below the rolling hills of the prairie. She had no idea how far she had come or in which direction. The sun blazed overhead, offering no mercy, and she realized with growing panic that she had no water, no food, and no shelter. She forced herself to stand, swaying on unsteady legs. The prairie stretched endlessly in every direction, an ocean of grass broken only by occasional clusters of rocks and stunted trees. She had grown up in a city where every street had a name and every corner offered the possibility of help. Here, there was nothing but earth and sky, and the terrifying realization that she was utterly alone. Eleanor chose a direction at random and began walking. Her city boots, already worn from travel, were not made for this terrain. Within an hour, blisters formed on her heels. Within 2 hours, those blisters had burst, leaving her feet raw and bleeding. She tried to ignore the pain, focusing instead on putting one foot in front of the other. Stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant confronting the full weight of her situation. The sun moved across the sky with agonizing slowness. Eleanor's throat became parched, her lips cracking in the dry air. She had passed several small streams during the wagon ride to Thornton's ranch, but she saw none now. The landscape that had seemed beautiful from the train window now felt hostile and merciless. She thought of her mother, who had always said that God never gave anyone more than they could bear. Eleanor wondered if her mother had been wrong. As afternoon stretched toward evening, Eleanor noticed something that made her blood run cold. Smoke rose in a thin column behind her, back in the direction of the ranch. The riders had likely set fire to Thornton's buildings, destroying evidence of their crime. Or perhaps they were searching for her, and the smoke was a signal to others. Either way, she needed to put more distance between herself and that place. She pushed forward as darkness began to fall. The temperature dropped rapidly once the sun disappeared, and Eleanor had no coat, only her thin shawl. She found a depression in the earth where several large rocks formed a partial windbreak and decided to rest there for the night. She had no way to make fire, no food or water. She curled into a ball, shivering, and watched the stars emerge overhead in numbers she had never imagined possible. Sleep came in fitful bursts interrupted by cold and fear. Every sound made her jump. The prairie at night was alive with noises she couldn't identify, rustlings and calls and distant howls that might have been wolves or coyotes or figments of her terrified imagination. She clutched her carpet bag to her chest and prayed for dawn. When morning finally came, Eleanor could barely stand. Her body had stiffened during the night, her feet had swollen inside her boots, and her mouth felt like it was lined with cotton. She knew that without water, she would not last another day. She had to find a stream, a spring, anything. She forced herself to move, scanning the horizon for any sign of water. That was when she saw them. Riders approaching from the east, silhouetted against the rising sun. Eleanor's first instinct was to hide, but there was nowhere to conceal herself in the open prairie. She stood frozen, watching the riders draw closer. As they approached, she realized these were not the men from Thornton's ranch. These riders sat differently on their horses, moved with different purpose. Their hair was long and dark, and they wore clothing she had only seen in illustrations. Indians. The word sparked immediate terror. Every story she had heard in Philadelphia about the Western Territories had included dire warnings about hostile tribes. She had been told they killed settlers without mercy, that they took captives and subjected them to unspeakable fates. She wanted to run, but her legs would not obey. She simply stood there, swaying slightly, as the riders approached. There were 4 of them, and they fanned out as they neared her, surrounding her in a loose circle. Their horses were painted with symbols she did not understand. The riders themselves studied her with expressions she could not read. One of them, the one directly in front of her, dismounted. He was tall and powerfully built, with a face marked by sharp, handsome features and eyes that seemed to see straight through her. He spoke in a language she did not understand, his tone questioning. Eleanor shook her head, her voice coming out as barely a whisper. "I don't understand. Please, I need help. Water." The man tilted his head, studying her with those intense dark eyes. He spoke again, this time mixing in a few English words she recognized. "Alone? Where your people?" "Dead," Eleanor managed, which was true enough. "I have nowhere to go." The man exchanged glances with his companions. They spoke among themselves in their own language, their tone serious. Eleanor waited, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Her fate hung in the balance, and she had no power to influence it. Finally, the man turned back to her. He made a gesture toward his horse. "Come," he said simply. "You die here. Come with us." Eleanor had no strength left to resist. When the tall warrior reached out his hand, she took it, allowing him to pull her up onto his horse. She sat in front of him, acutely aware of his presence at her back, his arms on either side of her as he guided the animal. The other riders fell into formation around them, and they rode north across the prairie at a pace that was swift but not punishing. She must have lost consciousness at some point because the next thing she knew, they were entering a camp. Teepees stood in organized clusters along the banks of a winding river. People emerged from their homes to watch the riders approach, their faces reflecting curiosity and some suspicion at the sight of the white woman. Eleanor felt their stares like physical touches, but she was too weak to care. The warrior who had carried her spoke to someone in their language, and moments later, Eleanor was being helped down from the horse. 2 women came forward, their expressions cautious but not unkind. They supported Eleanor between them and led her to one of the teepees. Inside, it was cooler and dim, the air scented with smoke and herbs. They laid her on soft buffalo robes and brought her water in a carved wooden bowl. Eleanor drank greedily, the liquid bringing tears to her eyes as it soothed her parched throat. The women tended to her feet, making soft sounds of sympathy at the state of her boots and the wounds beneath. They applied a paste that smelled of plants Eleanor could not name, then wrapped her feet in soft leather. One of them brought her a simple dress made of deerskin, gesturing that she should change from her torn and dirty cotton dress. Eleanor did so with clumsy fingers, her exhaustion making every movement difficult. For 2 days, Eleanor drifted in and out of feverish sleep. The women came and went, bringing her food and water, checking her feet, speaking to her in gentle tones she could not understand but found comforting nonetheless. When the fever finally broke, she woke to find an older woman sitting nearby, working on a piece of beadwork. The woman noticed Eleanor's open eyes and smiled. "You live," the woman said in careful English. "Good. I am Winona. You are in Lakota camp. You are safe here." Eleanor struggled to sit up, her head swimming. "Why did you help me?" "I thought," she stopped, ashamed to voice the prejudices she had been taught. Winona's smile turned sad, as if she knew exactly what Eleanor had been about to say. "We are not the monsters your people say. We help those who need help. The man who found you is Lakota. He is Chief's son. He say you were dying. So we help." Over the following days, Eleanor learned the rhythms of camp life. She was given tasks appropriate to her healing feet, simple work like shelling beans and grinding corn. The women of the camp remained cautious but gradually warmed to her presence. They taught her words in their language, laughing gently when she mangled the pronunciation. She learned that the Lakota called themselves the people, and that they had lived on these lands long before white settlers arrived. Lakota came to check on her progress. Through Winona's translation, he asked about how she had come to be alone on the prairie. Eleanor told him the truth, leaving nothing out. She spoke of her father's debts, of Gerald Patterson, of Samuel Thornton's lies and the men who had killed him. Lakota listened without interrupting, his face impassive, but his eyes showed understanding. "Your people make bargains with women like trading horses," he said through Winona. "This is not honor. Here, women choose their husbands. Women own their homes and property. Women have voice." Eleanor found this difficult to believe at first, so different was it from everything she had known. But as she watched the women of the camp, she saw it was true. They spoke their minds freely, made decisions about daily life, and were consulted on important matters. The men treated them with respect that seemed genuine, not performed. 3 weeks after her arrival, Eleanor could walk without pain again. She had learned enough Lakota to communicate basic needs and had begun to feel less like an intruder and more like a strange sort of guest. Lakota had taken to visiting her in the evenings, and through combinations of his broken English, her improving Lakota, and Winona's translations, they talked about many things. He told her about his people's struggle to maintain their way of life as more settlers pushed westward. He spoke of broken treaties and promises made by the white government that meant nothing. He described the buffalo herds that had once darkened the plains for days, now dwindling under the guns of hunters who killed for sport rather than need. His voice carried both pride and sorrow. Eleanor found herself drawn to him in ways that frightened and confused her. He was everything Philadelphia society would have deemed savage and unsuitable, yet he possessed more genuine honor than any gentleman she had known. He was patient with her ignorance, generous with his knowledge, and when he looked at her, she felt seen in a way she never had before. One evening, as they sat by the river watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and red, Lakota turned to her and spoke carefully in English. "You are healed now. If you wish to go to the white settlements, I will take you. You are not prisoner here." Eleanor looked at the water flowing past, constant and unchanging. She thought about returning to a world where she would always be property, where her choices were limited to which man would control her life. Then she thought about the freedom she had witnessed here, the respect, the sense of belonging to something larger than oneself. "What if I wanted to stay?" she asked quietly. Lakota's expression remained neutral, but Eleanor saw something flicker in his eyes. Hope, perhaps, or surprise. He was quiet for a long moment before responding. "To stay is not simple. You would need to learn our ways, speak our language, accept our customs. My people would need to accept you. Some will not trust. Some will never trust." Eleanor understood. She was the enemy in the eyes of many here. Her people had brought disease, broken treaties, and driven the buffalo to near extinction. She represented everything that threatened the Lakota way of life. Yet here she was, asking to become part of their world. "I want to try," she said. "If you will help me. If your people will allow it." Lakota studied her face as if searching for doubt or deception. Whatever he saw there must have satisfied him because he nodded slowly. "I will speak to my father, the chief. I will speak for you. But you must understand what you choose. Life here is hard. Winter comes with cold that kills. Food is not always certain. The white soldiers push us from our lands. This is not safe life." "I understand," Eleanor said, though she wondered if she truly did. My old life was not safe either. At least here, I have seen kindness. I have seen honor. That is more than I had before. The next day, Lakota brought Eleanor before his father, Chief Mapia. The meeting took place in the chief's teepee, with several elders present. Eleanor wore the deerskin dress the women had given her dark hair braided in the Lakota style. She sat as Winona had taught her, spine straight, eyes respectfully lowered until spoken to. Chief Mapia was an imposing figure, his face lined with age and wisdom. He looked at Eleanor for a long time before speaking. Winona translated his words. My son tells me you wish to stay with us. Why should we allow this? Your people take everything from us. They lie with every breath. Why are you different? Eleanor took a deep breath and met the chief's eyes. I cannot speak for all my people, only for myself. I do not ask you to trust me because I am trustworthy by nature. I ask you to judge me by my actions. Let me prove through work and respect that I wish to belong here. If I fail, send me away. But give me the chance to try. The elders conferred among themselves in low voices. Eleanor waited, her heart pounding. Finally, Chief Mapia spoke again. You may stay through one winter. If you survive, if you learn, if you show respect for our ways, we will speak again. My son has vouched for you. Do not make him regret this. Relief flooded through Eleanor so powerfully she felt dizzy. She placed her hand over her heart in the Lakota gesture of gratitude. Thank you. I will not fail you. The months that followed were the most challenging of Eleanor's life. She learned to tan hides, a process that was physically demanding and required skills she had never imagined. She learned to identify edible plants on the prairie, to preserve meat, to sew with sinew and bone needles. Her hands, once soft and kept carefully clean, became calloused and strong. Her body, once weak from city living, grew lean and capable. Winona became like a mother to her, teaching with patience and occasional sharp words when Eleanor's stubbornness got in the way of learning. The other women gradually accepted her presence, though some remained distant. Eleanor understood and did not push. Trust had to be earned, especially from people who had been given every reason to distrust. As autumn turned to winter, Eleanor and Lakota spent more time together. He taught her to ride properly, to read the weather in the sky, to understand the stories told in animal tracks. She taught him more English, though he proved a faster learner than she was. They talked about everything, their different childhoods, their hopes, their fears, their dreams for a future that seemed increasingly uncertain for his people. One night, as the first snow began to fall, Lakota came to Eleanor's teepee. He stood at the entrance, waiting for her invitation before entering. When she gestured him inside, he sat across from her, his expression serious. I must speak plainly, he said, his English now much improved. My heart chooses you, Eleanor. I wish you to be my wife, if you would have me. Not as property, as your people do. As equal partner. As one who shares my life by choice. Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes. In that moment, she understood that this was what freedom truly meant. Not the absence of hardship, but the presence of choice. The ability to say yes or no based on what her heart wanted, not what circumstances demanded. Yes, she whispered. My heart chooses you too. They were married in the Lakota tradition, a ceremony Eleanor would remember for the rest of her life. Chief Mapia performed the rites himself, a signal to the tribe that Eleanor was now truly one of them. She exchanged vows with Lakota beneath the wide prairie sky, promising to walk beside him through whatever challenges came. The tribe celebrated with feasting and dancing, and for the first time since her mother's death, Eleanor felt like she belonged somewhere. The winter was brutal, testing Eleanor in ways she had never imagined. There were nights when the cold seemed to seep into her very bones, days when food was scarce and hunger gnawed at her belly. But there was also warmth in Lakota's arms, laughter around the fires, and the deep satisfaction of surviving through community and shared strength. When spring finally arrived, melting the snow and bringing new life to the prairie, Chief Mapia called Eleanor before him once more. You have survived the winter, he said through Winona's translation, though Eleanor now understood most of his words. You have worked hard. You have shown respect. You are no longer a white woman living among us. You are Lakota. You are one of us. Eleanor touched her hand to her heart, tears streaming down her face. She had journeyed so far from the Philadelphia boarding house, from the desperate girl who had answered a mail-order bride advertisement. That journey had led her through terror and hardship, but it had also led her home. Not to a place, but to a people. Not to ownership, but to belonging. The curse she had thought was her fate, marrying a stranger out of desperation, had become the greatest blessing of her life. It had brought her to Dakota, to freedom, to a love built on mutual respect and choice. As she looked at her husband's proud face, at the community that had accepted her, Eleanor understood that sometimes the paths we fear most lead us exactly where we need to be.